Hello everybody. So, I discovered this video that I thought was very interesting. On the left, actually I need to figure out where I need to point because I'm mirrored, I think. Right, so on the left, which is my right, but never mind. On the left is Ms. Farah Khalidi. Farah. Big glasses. That lady. And she's, I don't know who she is. She's essentially irrelevant. And up here is Andrew Wilson, who is a very sharp man. And the whole video is being reacted to already by an individual who calls himself Truth in Frame, which I think is a really clever name. And I want to premise all of this with the fact that there's a fairly decent chance that I am not sufficiently intellectually capable to spar with somebody like Andrew or somebody like Truth in Frame, based on my understanding. I think they both talk a heck of a lot of sense in this particular video. Now, what is the video about? Specifically, it's a debate between Andrew and Miss Glasses. And Andrew argues to Ms. Glasses that equality is nonsensical because in order for equality to exist, men need to enforce it, fundamentally. So equality exists only insofar as the men in this hypothetical, theoretical space we're talking about, nation, whatever you want, agree and accept it, and therefore, and then also maintain it. I think so. I'm going to begin with the fact that I agree with the premise. I think the premise is strong. I think the way they're discussing it is strong. The way Andrew is proposing it, and I think that Ms. Glasses is entirely intellectually incapable to stand up to Andrew's scrutiny. However, there's something in the back of my mind that's nagging me. It's like, it's as if I think that the discussion is so logical and abstract that it ends up not including some potential elements. And I've written a couple of notes so that I'm not winging it too much this time around, but we shall see. So I want to give them a quick opportunity to talk through something. All three of them are going to say something, and then I'm going to see if I can in any way contribute to this, again, within the limits of my intellect, which I suspect is not at the level of these two individuals. I do not know anything about Mrs. Farah, but at least in this particular confrontation, she doesn't come across as particularly capable from this perspective. So, take it away, people.
Okay, so if that's true, if men are the enforcement mechanism, why does that then mean that women's equality is a bad idea?
Well, I didn't say it was a bad idea. I mean, it is, but what my position is that it's laughable that egalitarianism is even possible because women have no way to enforce their rights. They have to use men to enforce their rights. So since they have to use men to enforce their rights, they don't really have any rights because all the rights come from men. Oh, that's my position. It's absurd to have any belief in egalitarianism on its face because it's not actually possible except through the graciousness of men.
It's absurd to have egalitarianism because women cannot physically enforce their own rights, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah, so egalitarianism is not true. It's not real. It's false. It's only possible through men, in other words. It's not possible through women. Women can't be equal unless men allow them to be equal, which means it's paradoxical because this means that they're never going to be equal because men are going to always be the arbiters of what that equality is because women can't enforce it. So.
But why does the notion of egalitarianism have to be predicated on physical strength or like who gets to enforce it?
Well, what else could it be predicated on?
Principles of like what's best for society
And what happens if somebody violates those principles?
Equal,
Sure.
like, why would it be based off the enforcement?
What happens if somebody violates those principles?
What do you mean?
Well, so if you have a society in which you have laws and government and things like this, and whatever social contracts you come up with, what happens if one side violates those principles, or a person or an individual or a group violates those principles? What would you do with them? You would, well, I would think, arrest them maybe, or punish them, or do something punitive, or put them in prison or something like that. And so you're right back to the enforcement mechanism again. So there's really no way around it. The enforcement mechanism is from men, will always be from men. And so it's paradoxical to say that women can have equal rights, because even if they do have equal rights, it's just because men have allowed them to.
And this is where she's stuck. She keeps treating equality like it's a moral slogan, when the conversation is about whether it can actually exist as a stable condition. Those are two completely different questions. You can believe equality is good and still admit it only survives if someone stronger maintains it. But she won't go there. Because once you admit that, equality stops being noble and starts being fragile. So instead you get words like principles and intellectual equality. And once that happens, you already know there's no answer coming. Principles don't resolve conflict. Conflict gets resolved when someone wins. That's just reality. And notice what never happens. There's never a mechanism. No explanation for how equality survives disagreement, refusal, or force. It just assumes cooperation forever. That assumption is the flaw. Any system that only works when everyone behaves isn't a system. It's a fantasy. That's why this keeps going in circles. Andrew's talking about failure cases. She's talking about ideals that collapse the moment someone says no.
Okay, so it's fairly rare for me to let something go this long. I hope this doesn't result in some sort of takedown request. I just wanted to make sure that everybody would express themselves in full within the snippet that I wanted to talk about. Okay, so there's a few very, very interesting aspects about this. As I said, I think Andrew and Truth and Frame are correct. Both of them are reasoning almost impeccably from my personal perspective. I mean, I'm not going to declare that it's going to be humble every 5 seconds, otherwise we don't go anywhere. But yeah, and the lady over there is not capable of countering this in any way. I agree. And I agree with the observation of the paradox. Now, I want to start with something to begin with, which is equality or equity, basically sameness, is a completely nonsensical idea. It's a nonsensical principle as well, because it is not based in any way on observation, on reality. And fundamentally speaking, I think this is really what Wilson is getting at. He's getting at it in a very Socratic fashion, though it still feels to me like he's running intellectual circles around there a little bit, as Truth and Frame seems to agree. But that's because the proposition that is put forward with equality is so flatly, obviously nonsensical that it's peculiar to me that it requires a demonstration. The problem is it's a fundamental sleight of hand. Let's take, for instance, the concept of equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. So many people will say equality of outcome is bad, but equality of opportunity is good, and so on. But these are all slogans, because equality of opportunity is just as nonsensical as equality of outcome. Essentially, every single situation, every single individual, every single atom in this organism that so many people like to call society, unfortunately, all of the atoms act of their own accord and depend on circumstances that are entirely theirs. Even in the most controlled situation, like, for example, twins that are identical and that are born from a certain specific family and grow up, they still grow up differently. They still have changes mutations within their lives experiences over the course of their life, as well as at birth. There is no such thing as equity, as identicalness. It's nonsense. The entire idea starts from the communistic principle that everybody's a worker ant, and there are only worker ants, and that's just not how anything works. Everything is different, always. Therefore, the entire idea falls flat on its face, because and where's the sleight of hand? So the sleight of hand is there. Of course, Mike, I don't mean equity, everybody's the same. Of course, every atom is different, but in principle, right, for all of the rights and so on and so forth. And now we go down another quagmire, which is, what in the heck is a right? Which I will talk about, but later. First, after having made the premise that the fellas are right and that equality isn't a thing, we're now dancing with a lady. We're now pretending that equality is a thing and demonstrating that equality doesn't work. And Truth and Frame and Andrew both essentially state that the existence of this particular paradigm is only possible so long as there is some entity, a policing entity, that decides to maintain this machinery through usually punitive action. And Truth and Frame says something in particular that I think is very, very interesting, that he says that if you have a system, he says, where you are relying on permanent cooperation by everybody, then you essentially have a system that doesn't work. Or you have a fantasy, I think, is the terminology he uses. And I don't think this is true. Because the enforcement system, I mean, Wilson doesn't really say this. Wilson simply talks about the fact that it's men that do that, because what Wilson has done is he has acknowledged that men, generally speaking, are stronger, bigger, whatever, more dominant, more capable of dominance, that they can, should they choose to, dominate. And they dominate right now by choosing not to exercise that dominance, essentially. Or by exercising it in a passive way that the ladies seem to find palatable. Long story short, I suppose. Even though I kind of disagree with that as well. But, so, let's disagree with Truth and Frame first. So Truth and Frame said, a system that isn't enforced is a system that doesn't work. I really don't agree, and I think there's lots of examples that can be used to observe this. For instance, one of the best examples of this is the example of roads and how they work. For instance, driving requires a license. The license is the enforcement arm of the laws says, if you drive without this document, I will punish you. However, I will say that you are not allowed. And if I catch you, I will then punish you. Yes, that's true, but that's dependent on you catching me. It doesn't mean I can't drive. Also, the license doesn't say anything about my capability of driving. I mean, my wife has a driver's license, and frankly speaking, I'm not sure that's healthy for anyone. Fortunately, she agrees, so she doesn't drive. But she does have a driver's license. So then, step number 2 is when you drive, there's all of the rules. There's the signs that communicate what you're supposed to do. Let's say speed limits, because that's an easy one to immediately think about. Because speed limits are frequently enforced. There is a fundamental problem with that, which is frequently. And the reason why that's a problem is because almost every human being speeds in various ways, to various degrees, at various levels of frequency, and so on and so forth. Which is fascinating, because the quantity of tickets, while absolutely enormous, continues to be enormous, and continues not to go down and continues not to work. At least not to work in the way that is described on the speed signs. Meaning, if over here it says 70 and I do 72 and I get caught and I get fined for doing 72, I will do 70 potentially for a week and then go back to doing 72, right? If I am very wealthy, I can do 100, get caught, get impounded, have to pay a massive fine, pay the fine, get the vehicle back. If I live in a country, and then repeat, if I live in a country in which it's not, my license gets taken away, I can still hop on a vehicle and drive, and then it gets enforced again and again and again, etc., and I get punished further and further and further and further and further. But this clearly indicates, right, that these laws are ignorable. And it also indicates that a huge chunk of the population, while they ignore them to some extent, they also don't ignore them to a large extent. For instance, the quantity of traffic violations that have to do with not stopping at a stop sign or not stopping at a traffic light is almost certainly, I mean, I don't have information at hand, and even if I did, it would vary from place to place, etc. So becomes chaos. But I'm sure that speed limits are punished way more than almost anything else, right? Here in Europe, we've got speed cameras, we've got average speed cameras. Ooh, those are a doozy. And so on and so forth, right? And all of this stuff is inserted and to try and get people to enforce. And anybody who drives in Europe knows full well that you are going to use an app called Waze. Waze is going to tell you, look, in 500 meters, you have an area in which there's an average speed limit. Okay, sounds great. I'm going to slow right down to that speed limit, to that speed limit for that time, and then I'm going to speed right back up as soon as I leave it. Right? So, is it effective? Yes, because the average speed camera is the most tyrannical possible machinery at that one time, and everybody assumes it to be very effective. But it doesn't work at all, and people immediately start disobeying again. You would need to have a complete circuit of eternal and total enforcement. Right? But generally speaking, driving is very safe. Generally speaking. I'm not going to go into debates as to what is general, how much safety on the road is safe enough or whatever. Which also means that loads of people, generally speaking, vaguely are around the speed limits or accept certain laws of the road much more. For example, if you drive a BMW, you're legally obligated not to use your indicators. I do not know why that is. That's a weird, peculiar breach of the law, and that never gets enforced. I mean, Wilson is American. It sounds, Truth and Frame also sounds American. You people don't know the difference between right and left. On your highways are retarded. Okay, you have highways with like 5-6 lanes and that sort of stuff. I've been there, right? And you all drive on the wrong side of the road, like you become English for a bit. You're all mentally challenged from the perspective. There is a law for that, and nobody's enforcing it, right? And everybody breaks it because nobody believes in it. So it sounds like I'm agreeing with your point. Because nobody enforces it, it doesn't work. It doesn't exist. I am. Partially, however. Because the vast majority of people do agree that the stop sign is important, and that doesn't need enforcement. And most people stop at the stop sign. And usually it's very simple to understand why. Because if you don't stop at the stop sign and you cross the stop sign at full blast and somebody else is crossing the road on the other side really, really gently and nice and they plow straight through you, or you T-bone them, the consequences of your refusal to follow this particular rule are catastrophic, but not because of enforcement. They are catastrophic because of the consequences, because of physics in this case. Right? The whole equality thing, which as I said is stupid a priori, but fundamentally speaking it should be reframed to treating women with a certain level of respect, is one of the things, and again I'm not going to go into detail about these things, it's too large for the scope of this, is something that I think is extremely desirable for people that live in the world in which we live. But this is not something, like meaning in the West, this is not something, and it's debatable by the way, but it's not something that is enforced. It's not even on a philosophical level. It's more like on it's on a dogmatic level, pretty much. So I will say, I prefer to live in a place where enslavement of women is unnecessary. Right? Where I can have a conversation with a woman and live in a relatively normal fashion. I don't need to have her covered head to toe. I don't need her to disappear. And so on and so forth. Again, very long conversation about what would be preferable, what wouldn't be preferable, and then it becomes subjective and da. What I don't know that is really that subjective is the fact that the West, as an example, generalizing, has certain characteristics, one of which is this thing about women's, quote, rights, would benefit that much, or would become more enjoyable to the men who would then enforce something different. Because as a parent, one will know very quickly that yes, you can be extremely tyrannical with your children and enforce this, that, and the other, etc. as your children resent you and the resentment boils, and then maybe somebody will rebel and as Truth and Frame is saying, win this different conflict and overthrow your tyrannical dictatorship of the home. That's one way of doing it. But another way of doing it is to explain certain dogmas, certain truths that we hold to be self-evident. And then the idea is not to enforce them unless there is a violation of them, but hey pronto, hey presto, what happened? Everybody within this vicinity has decided to agree to these points. And there's lots of these elements that make loads of sense, or that are easy to relate to. For example, the First Amendment. Right? The First Amendment that says you can say whatever you want fundamentally and nobody can stop you. Now, there are loads of people and peoples that can't stand that, right? That will want to remove it, etc. And Wilson and Truth and Frame are correct in saying, if enough people, if enough men band together and say, I want to destroy the First Amendment, I want to remove the First Amendment, we all want to remove the First Amendment, we will fight a battle with the others to remove the First Amendment. The battle could be physical, could be intellectual, doesn't particularly matter. The First Amendment is removed. There you go, we have removed the First Amendment, etc. But all of a sudden then the numbers matter. And the world does become about force and not about ideas. And the world that I care about, for example, loses something. It's almost as if the concept of the Constitution, which is a document, supersedes, in fact, theoretically, logically, attacks and attempts to demolish the capability of the men to take over and destroy the document and say, we don't need no document anymore, we're going to work without the document, force is back in force, baby. Yes, this is truthfully, as they say, how it can work. But the Constitution, in my personal opinion, attempts to make things work differently. Of course, it was spearheaded by men and worked in that way by men, but it was inculcated and educated by everybody. The male teachers, the female teachers, the media, whatever, the state, I don't know, everybody participated in trying to depict the American exceptionalism in saying, hey, we are special, we don't punish you here if you believe the Holocaust never happened. You know, you're free to believe that. Go ahead. That's, of course, I'm using that as just an example. Okay? Or you don't have to wear a hijab if you don't want to, And if somebody makes you wear a hijab, come talk to us. We're going to help you out, the enforcement, okay? Because somebody is violating this truth. And this is, I think, the principles that Farah is attempting, that Glass Lady is attempting to say. Maybe. The point is, I think that this enforcement, let's call it, is kind of grassroots. I think grassroots may be the wrong term. It sort of comes, every atom is playing a small part in this, I think. Now, Wilson argues that it's the men doing it, and I actually still agree with him. But I don't necessarily agree that the enforcement is the only one thing that makes an idea or a set of laws a reality. I agree that if push comes to shove, that's where something happens, right? But I don't know necessarily how useful it is to discuss the how things are at wartime and not how things are during peacetime. Because in my analogy of driving, which is kind of outside of peace and war, meaning there's no conflict, yes, there is an enforcement going on, of course, but there is so much wrong behavior that keeps on happening that goes unpunished. And that is because the rules are stupid, many of them, and so many people disagree with them. Right? For example, like I said, the Americans that don't know how to drive on a highway, and Canadians are the same, you all are pathetic. Okay? From that perspective. In the same way, say, Italians don't know how not to drive drunk. Right? It's these cultural differences, these cultural embraces are interesting because, generally speaking, the traffic code is almost identical in every country. So this is very interesting, in my personal opinion, because it acts as a sort of almost like a lab experiment. It is a little bit more nuanced than just the willingness to enforce something, I think. That's my humble opinion from this perspective. Now, before I conclude this video, which has been going a bit long, there's one more thing I want to touch on as well. I have in my little notes over there, which is the problem with language. Okay? I get accused very frequently of making semantic arguments. I think that in and of itself is an intellectual sleight of hand / misnomer, at least in my opinion, within my limited intellect. And here is why I think it's important. Because the only way for human beings to communicate with one another, it's an exaggeration but close enough, is through the spoken or written word. Therefore, what words mean, their semantics, are extremely important in order to be able to get to understanding, to move information from one mind to somebody else's mind. Right? This lady, for example, in this particular case, as Truth and Frame points out correctly, there's only two options. Either refuses to accept Andrew Wilson's points, because if she were to accept them, her entire world concept would collapse. So that's a willing thing. Or is intellectually incapable of accepting Andrew's point, which I think is more probable, based on observation. But all of them, Andrew and her, are using words. And sometimes the way they use words is either unclear or potentially doesn't match. For example, enforcement. I have just put forward a case that enforcement is also done at a cultural level. Meaning most Americans are happy to hog the left lane, everybody hates them, and they still do it, and they don't care at all whether you care or don't. Or most Italians don't stop if you're trying to cross the road on a zebra crossing as a pedestrian, because Italians don't care about pedestrians. It's obviously illegal, and they still do it. Sometimes it gets enforced by the people who enforce it, the police, I'd say, but it's not enforced by the people, therefore it ceases existing, or by the drivers, and so on. So enforcement isn't quite as simple as, I'm going to grab a club and conk you on the head if you don't do what I want you to do, right? Andrew talks about this enforcement as a fact of life. He does not really give it any level of moral valence or tinge, and I think that's a good thing. However, I do think it's interesting to at least pay lip service to that, because while it's true that equality doesn't exist, I don't want to live in Saudi Arabia. I don't want to live in Birmingham. Because if I wanted to live in Pakistan/Birmingham, I would also dress in white ridiculous gowns and wear a ridiculous beard and hold hands with other fellas on the street while I loiter and segregate all of the females in places. But I don't. I think this is just an awful way to live. Right? So the enforcement is more nuanced than that. Okay, now let's go to the word that bothered me the most, which is the word right. I am firmly convinced that the word right doesn't exist. If one does read the Founding Fathers' papers and the Constitution, etc., this word is used, but it's used very intelligently, very carefully. Nowadays, it is my personal impression that the word right is used with a level of frivolousness that is really rather unbecoming of anybody's intellect. You have a right to shelter. No, you don't. You have a right to, etc. You have a right to chase the American dream. You don't have a right to that. What you do have a right to, let's say, is that somebody doesn't unlawfully impede you from progressing there. Now this is very, very specific, unlawfully, because for instance, say when whites argue for black reparations, right, and they say stuff like, yes, but black people have a right to shine just as much as white people have a right to shine, and because white people have privilege, they have an easier hand. Blacks' rights should be slightly more righteous than other rights. They should be a little bit more equal than everybody else. Another example, equality, equity. These are all words that are so distorted from an Orwellian perspective, or within an Orwellian paradigm, because equality, right, etc., they're supposed to mean something. An inalienable right would be a truth that we hold self-evident dogmatically, right? So it is dogmatically the case that all men are born equal, the Founding Fathers said. Okay, so, good man or white man or good character. But that means that, for example, if you want to own a person or enslave a person or that sort of stuff, various laws derive from this particular self-evident observation, which becomes a dogma. Okay? Therefore, you have a right to self-determination. Okay? Or say the First Amendment that says you have a right to speak your mind. Right? That effectively has nothing to do with speech. It has a lot to do with thought. You are capable of thinking whatever you want. So, do you want to think that America is disgusting? You can. Do you want to think that that a race is inferior to another? You can. So when then the equality soldiers come in and says, no, we all have equal rights. You can't think that Jamal is inferior to Joe. But you've used the term right to express something false that doesn't exist by misinterpreting another bit of the text in order to now contradict a bit of the text that's extremely clear and says that I can think whatever I want. And this happens all the time. And it makes it very difficult to have this kind of discussion. This makes it very difficult for me to react to things because I was given negative feedback by some of you people watching before because I interrupt videos too frequently. And one of the reasons why I do is because I am actively bothered by how people speak and the words that they use. Fortunately, Andrew in particular is somebody that is excellent from this perspective. He tends to be very, very precise with his words, and I very much appreciate that. Anyway, so I've waffled on long enough. I haven't refuted Andrew's point. I think Andrew's point is strong and essentially unassailable, but I do think there is something there. Specifically, the fact that the whole one sex over the other sex is, I have accepted a priori. You will have noticed that as I speak, I'm not even referring to that. It genuinely doesn't matter. Arguing that women are capable of doing anything on their own is ridiculous from that perspective, because all you need is a couple of fellas that say, I don't think so, and it all ends very, very quickly. So not that I'm saying that that's a desirable situation. I'm just saying that is a factual situation, and that's what Andrew was saying as well. However, I think there is a little bit more depth in all of this, which is the world that Ms. Farah probably prefers, which is the one in which she can dress in the way that she wants, behave in the way that she wants, roll her eyes like an absolute champion, at least in some aspects, is more desirable than a world in which Ms. Farah wouldn't be able to do that. And I also wanted to say, as hopefully I made clear, or at least somewhat clear, that I think the enforcement comes from every individual. This Truth and Frame seems to, he said actively that a system without enforcement is a fantasy. No. A system without enforcement is a culture. That's what it is. And that is important as well and interesting. That deserves its own thing, because I think as a concept the idea of culture is probably going somewhat extinct, in large part because of the quantity of contamination coming from other cultures. Contamination that is deeply undesirable. And this contamination that is undesirable manages to instill itself into a place because of the lack of enforcement coming from the local culture of its own merits. And that, for example, isn't being enforced at all. To the point in which, yes, some men may come and conk me on the head to say that I need to be a dhimmi at some point or something like that. It's an exaggeration at the moment, but yeah. So I don't know. It was a very interesting video. I really enjoyed it, as I usually do Andrew's content. So I think I'm done here. Ta-ta.